Right, we're now moving on to our second keynote address. Dr. Britta Zawada, she is the Director of Institutional Audits Council on Higher Education. And I was just reading a little bit about Britta's work, and there was an article published in the SACWA Bulletin 2020, Institutional Audits for South Africa Higher Education in the Era of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And in that, Britta mentions that institutional audits have been acknowledged as an effective mechanism to improve quality in higher education. But this was what really I thought was interesting, referring to e-learning. It is acknowledged that the technical ICT infrastructure at an institution may impact directly on quality, although the question remains whether it would be appropriate for a quality council working with peer academics who may not be experts in ICT requirements to focus on such technical requirements. So Britta's going to be looking at quality assurance in a hybrid university setting. How are we bringing all these things together? How do we get into this new era where we have to apply quality standards to something that is so new to us? Who's going to guide us? Who's going to implement? Who's going to measure it? Who's going to control it? And so let's hand over after a short, brief intro video to Britta Zawada.
Dr. Britta Zawada completed her degree at SUN with her master's and doctoral studies in cognitive linguistics at UNISA. She holds postgraduate qualifications in teaching from the University of Pretoria, distance education and e-learning from the University of Maryland in the United States of America. Professor Zawada first started at Stellenbosch and later at UNISA, progressing from a contract junior lecturer to eventually being the chair of the Department of Linguistics at UNISA. She has experience of scientific editing, translation, and interpreting from fields such as geology, theology, and linguistics. She ended her 33 years at UNISA with a decade of various leadership roles in the College of Human Sciences, mostly with a focus of teaching and learning and quality assurance. She was awarded the UNISA Lifetime Achievements Award for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. Professor Zawada presented nationally and internationally at conferences, has published 16 articles and a book, as well as supervised both master's and doctoral students in cognitive linguistics. She is currently the Director of Institutional Audits at the Council of Higher Education in South Africa.
Good morning, everyone. Craig, I'm assuming I can continue. Can I just check that the sign language interpreter can hear me? Thank you. Thanks. So good morning, everyone, and thank you to Professor Sonka and Badru for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be with UKZN, although I am at another conference. I hope this room is not too echoey. It sounds very echoey to me. But it's really a pleasure to be with you and to share some of my thoughts with you. And thank you, Professor Bong, for your very inspiring and lively and sort of futuristic view of where we can go with technology-enhanced teaching. Professor Bong may not know that we are nationally within a space of institutional audits where all the universities are being audited for quality or reviewed for quality. And so I might be I don't want to say the most hated person in the higher education space at this time around, but I do hope that we are all aware that making sure that our quality is up to scratch and that we have transitioned through this time of the pandemic with quality for our students. So it might be also up to me to kind of bring you back to earth a little bit after that very inspiring futuristic talk that you've just had, and it will be, and hopefully I will give you some tools on how to navigate some of these issues. So just a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. My title was changed from Quality Assurance in Blended and Online Learning to Quality Assurance in a Hybrid University. I don't know by whom, but I'm rolling with it here. So I'll just look at some definitions. I'll just look at what we understand by integrated quality assurance management, and then particularly look at the 3 pillars of quality assurance. Namely self-reflection, peer review, and evidence, and a short conclusion. So I want to refer to a 2014 publication by the CHE on distance education. And you will have seen that Professor Curtis came at this from the IT side, from the technology side. Whereas in South Africa, we have a very, very long history of distance education, with UNISA being more than 100 years old, and several other institutions being in distance education. So one of the ways in which we can think of distance education, and then thinking of distance education as a kind of umbrella term, where a lot of the different kind of technologies have been around for some time. So the overarching definition of distance education, whether it's online or whatever it may be, is that there is space and geographical distribution, space and geographic, and also often in terms of time, between the lecturers and the students. You can go on the one hand of the continuum from being face-to-face on campus through various versions of mixed mode to the extreme where you have different models of blended, and then where the lecturers and students never see each other, are never physically in touch, and also the students amongst each other. The other axis of this is the extent of ICT support. So you can go from no digital support, the traditional correspondence model. When UNISA started over 100 years ago, the academics actually wrote by hand letters to the students which were posted. Then you can go to a digital correspondence mode where you have online, like for example, email, using emails and PDF documents would be digital correspondence. But then you can also, from the face-to-face perspective, you can think of digital tools being used in the classroom. And if you think of some of the examples Professor Bonk had, where you even had, for example, a robot in the classroom. But then you can go into the more internet-supported and internet-dependent modes where you can have digital reading, which is supported by the internet, where you wouldn't have to be online all of the time. But then you go to a space where you are dependent on being online all of the time during the entire learning process. And that would then mean that you go to digital online reading where there are activities and interactions, right up to the sort of far right where even your assessment may be online. Many of our blended modules and models in the country, for example, are online, but then the students come in for the exam also to take care of the authenticity. So just some of the definitions. So in terms of the contact model, face-to-face, as opposed to distance education, I've talked about that, but I want you to focus on some of the nouns in these words that we are using. We talk about distance education, but then we talk about blended and online learning, where you have this continuum of mixed mode, and where the choice is a pedagogical choice. And there were some of the questions in the previous session which also asked this: how can we make sure that we don't go just in a technology, like embrace the technology for technology's sake, but that we make good pedagogical choices in our curriculum design? And then, of course, the pandemic hit us and we had what we called emergency remote teaching. So we go from learning, from broad education to learning with a focus on the student, but then to teaching during the pandemic, where the academics were just trying, it's almost like a one-way model of just giving the information to the students. But then also the hybrid learning, where we have a continuum, where you have that mixture. And also to remember that these can be at different levels. So you can decide on a module being hybrid or high flex. Professor Bonk also referred to that, where the student basically makes the choice. So to me, the difference between blended and online learning, and especially blended learning and high flex learning, in blended learning, the nature of the discipline and the academic makes a pedagogical choice about what is online and what is face-to-face. For example, a practical in a laboratory being, or if you think of social work or psychology, those kinds of choices, and whether it's even necessary. And then high flex is where the student decides. Everything is available online in both modes, physical and online, and the student gets to choose. The hybrid university means that it has all of the above, and that you have to manage that in a particular way. And I think that would be quite a challenge if you can have those choices at different levels, departments making different choices, programs making different choices, modules and individual lecturers making just different choices. So the differences between contact, the previous full contact, and online learning and teaching and distance education lies in the design. Previously, when an academic read a new article, they could walk into the classroom the next day and change what they were doing. But in online learning and distance education, the design often happens long before. You have to train people to do that design. The design is often in a team, as you've seen in these videos, with video designers, with instructional designers, and so on. So that makes that there is a much longer lead time. You can't just from today to tomorrow change what you want to do. It's also very much resource-based. So you can develop videos, you can develop books or texts that you can put online. And that is why the student engagement part, actually engaging with students, is so important, so that it is designed into the module or the program. So distance education has always had a very clear focus on quality assurance because it had to justify itself. The norm was also the contact, the professor, the sage on the stage doing addressing huge lecture rooms, and there was or the tutorial model where you have smaller groups with tutors and so on. But distance education all over the world has a very clear focus on quality assurance. And I'm not going to go into that so much, but in my references, and I'll share my presentation, there are quite a few of those questionnaires. Somebody asked about questionnaires from the Commonwealth of Learning, from different institutions all over the world about how you can check surveys to check whether your student engagement is working, whether you're learning, your resources are learning, and so on. But then during the pandemic, when we had this emergency remote teaching, and some of you will remember Professor Glatschweier came from UKZN, he's now at UJ, but he talks about that you cannot dump content on the internet and call that pedagogy. He's a decolonial scholar and critique that in many ways. Then from the HEQC and CHE perspective, it's very important for you as a university and as individual academics to look at how the HEQC looks at quality. And this is also where our perspective would be different from, for example, an international or a US perspective, is that we have this transformation imperative. The Transformation Oversight Committee that reported directly to the Minister has been dissolved, or its term came to an end, and that transformation mandate, oversight, monitoring and evaluation of transformation, has come to the CHE. But if you know the work of the CHE and the HEQC, you will have seen that right from its founding in document in 2001, it has always seen quality as transformation and transformation as quality, that these two things cannot be dissolved from each other, that they are very closely related. So as we go forward into what we call the new quality assurance framework, we will be developing these new higher education practice standards. And some of the cross-cutting themes in those, what we call HEPS or higher education practice standards, will then be very closely tied to transformation. For example, how do we achieve a sustainable, equitable society, and how do you as a university, be it a hybrid university or a contact university, what role do you play in that? How do you see your role as a hybrid university, as a site of personal change and transformation, of cultural change and transformation, and for societal change and transformation? And how do you relate that to your vision, mission, identity, goals as UKZN? Then authentic leadership and management of teaching and learning of the university as a whole. How is that managed, but in service of the academic project in a hybrid university? And you will see that I tend to ask questions. I tend to not give answers. So that's sort of my style. So that how do you as UKZN, as a hybrid university, then look at your agency and your identity and your relationality between staff and students, with staff to each other and staff to management, students to each other, the SRC to management? These are all relational sort of spaces that we have to navigate, as well as to your external environment, to your communities, to your province, as well as to national goals. But then if you think of these, what we sometimes call the wicked problems or perhaps opportunities, how do we use all of these things in higher education, in UKZN as a hybrid university, to address these so-called wicked problems that we have in Southern Africa? Poverty and unemployment, social and political instability, environmental degradation with food and water insecurity. And then you add that technological development, the 4IR, the kind of perspective Professor Bonk gave into this space. And how are you as UKZN, but even your faculty, your school, your department, and you as an individual in your module, how are you going to navigate that? So when we look at quality assurance and integrated quality management, I talked about this design, that it cannot happen by accident. You cannot leave it to individuals and just hoping it will happen throughout the institution. It has to be a system that is designed. That system has to be systematic. It has to be deliberately designed with policies, with planning, but also with resources. And then we can add capacity development. Your resources would be your institutional ICT infrastructure, your physical campus infrastructure, but also your resources, and in higher education, your most important resource are your human resources. How do you equip your academics to do this? This has then to be implemented in all corners of the university, across all campuses of the university, and in specific timeframes. But then after the implementation, the monitoring and evaluation, how do we make sure that it happens? And not just that it happens, but it happens in a particular way. Not just a kind of tick box, yes, we've done the module evaluations this year, yes, we got the student feedback this year, but how do you make sure that it happens at a particular level of quality? And I'll come back to that. And this then has to feed into this continuous improvement, closing the quality loop. And this always has to be at two levels. It can be at the level of improving the actual integrated quality management system, but it must always be at the academic project level, at the module level, at the program level, at the level of your community engagement, or whatever it is you do. Because after all, the point is to improve the quality of what the students receive. So if we look at quality assurance, there are three main pillars which are sort of accepted pillars of quality assurance throughout the world. The first one is self-reflection. The second one is peer review. And the third one is that all of this has to be based on evidence. And then remember I said it has to be designed. It can't be accidental. So how do you design these three elements of quality assurance into your systems at UKZN as a hybrid university so that you develop a culture? So when you first do the design and you first start implementing a design, there might be resistance because this is a new way of doing. But then as you get new staff in, they will find this way of doing that everybody understands, that building this culture of continuous quality improvement is there. And it's there in all corners of the university, not just in some corners of the university. So on the one hand, there's this deliberate design, but the purpose really is to create a quality culture, a culture of continuous improvement and striving for excellence. So I'm looking a little bit at time, and some of you who've gone through the training of the CHE would have gone through this idea of reflexivity. We built it into the way we did the capacity development for the institutional audits, but we're also wanting the new quality assurance framework to really be built on this reflexive generative methodology. It's important that we look at ourselves critically, analytically, and systematically. And it goes back to that idea of a design. It has to be taken seriously. We have to look at our bias and our hidden assumptions so that we remember that we are actually busy with an activity which is grounded in education as a social science. We then can look at epistemic reflexivity, which looks at our belief systems, our aims, and our meta-theoretical assumption, or at our methodological reflexivity in terms of how we do things. So we can reflect as a community, not just on our theory, but also on our practices, but we have to reflect on our lived African experience, where we are, contextualizing it in our locality and our historicity, for both ourselves and for our students. We cannot divorce what we are doing in terms of our teaching and learning and how we reflect on that from our context, our location, and our history. What reflexivity should not be, it shouldn't be individualistic, it should be collective and objective, it should be non-skepticist, not negative and destructive, but within that space of transformative and constructive space of care, collegiality, and in community. But reflexivity does not mean that we are not accountable to each other, accountable to our students, and accountable to the taxpayer who, after all, is providing for you as a public university. So when we look at reflexive practices, we can say that it's a deliberate and systematic critical analysis of my personal, our communal, and our institutional knowledge base in all practice areas of academic life. But it cannot be without a purpose. It has to be with this purpose in aid of what? Constructing new knowledge about ourselves and others so that we can transform, so that we get into that space of continuously improving our ways of knowing, our ways of doing, and our ways of being in this learning and teaching community. So here are just some of the questions that we can ask ourselves. What values and biases do I bring to my curriculum? To learning, teaching, and assessment. Sorry, there's a typo. What transformation am I trying to achieve individually in my module, but then for the class as a whole and or for the program as a whole? What conscious and unconscious decisions do I make about curriculum, about learning and teaching, and assessment? What conditions for learning do I create? How static or interactive is my learning space? Do I meet my students where they are? Do I even know who they are? But then also that transformative next step. Do I sort of take them out of their comfort zones. Very important for us. Do I transcend arrogance in my teaching practice? Do I think I know everything and the students know nothing? Or am I reproducing the bad methods that I was exposed to when I was a student? And then whose standards and criteria do you look at when you look at evaluating yourselves? So then a model for reflexive praxis, and this is set against the idea of criteria, minimum criteria, which kind of create a kind of tick box, bureaucratic kind of way of doing quality assurance. We want to look at your personal reflections, at your community reflections, in your teams, in a module or in a program with your students, so that you have that iterative, continuous improvement, where you can redesign, reinvent yourself, but where the academic staff have agency and they can be the ones leading this process as facilitators. The second part then is around the peer review. We look then at the idea that you as the institutions are actually responsible for quality and quality assurance. The Higher Education Act states that. It's also the basis of the institutional audits and the new quality assurance framework. So there should be a focus on your internal quality assurance. We as the CHE and the HEQC come and do the external quality assurance. But then it's important for you as a hybrid university to ask yourself, who actually are your peers? Do you choose peers that are going to keep you in a status quo, or are you choosing peers that are actually going to challenge you to move into new spaces and to continuously improve? Are you choosing peers which are just going to give you the nod and say you're doing well, or as I said, are going to challenge you? And then how do you respond to their inputs? Do you just say, here they are, but we never actually, it goes to files 55 or 13. So this importance of regular program reviews, module reviews, faculty and departmental reviews is very important. And how is that supported by evidence? I was going to look at the community of inquiries. Professor Bong spoke a little bit about social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence, but I'm going to run out of time. The references are there. I was hoping to be very practical, to look at 10 or 20 ways to create teaching presence. There's some ideas there for you. I'm not going to go through all of them. The website is there for you to click on. We can look at that. Then also social presence. I wanted to pick out one of them. Somewhere here there's one which says turn on your camera, or ask your students to turn on your camera. But it's also important that you think of how that works in your space. If your student is living in a shack, which they are sharing with 10 other people, asking them to turn on their camera may actually be an act of humiliation. So that is why it is so important that you are sure that you know who your students are, not just in a general way, in a very personal, interactive way. Then we go to the evidence, and Craig mentioned that SAQA article in the SAQA bulletin where we looked, for example, at evidence. These are the standards from the framework and the manual for the current institutional audits. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's very important that you go from data to actually understanding your data, actually interpreting the data, and actually acting on the results, so that that can assist you to lead to continuous improvement, so that your decision makers are not just compliant, but that they, in terms of the regulatory kind of data that you have to have, but that you also look at specifically sourced data, not just quantitative data, but also qualitative data. So this institutional research should be part of that deliberate, systematic and critical investigation and inquiry that supports that reflection, that self-knowledge and self-understanding. And then to what purpose? To deliberately systematically and creatively transform and continuously improve what you are doing. What does institutional research mean at UKZN? Also thinking that there are different levels of research. It can be at the level of the institution, it can be at the level of a program or a module. So just in terms of quality and quality assurance in a hybrid environment, to emphasize that you cannot leave it to chance or accident or even to individuals. And integrated quality management has to be deliberately, consciously designed as a system, a fit-for-purpose system, which has that design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation to create this culture of continuous improvement. It should be based on the 3 pillars or elements of quality assurance, which is self-reflection, peer review, and based on evidence, but then always in a South African context with a view to transformation and understanding that quality is transformation and transformation is quality. You cannot divorce the two from each other. I think that's more or less my time, Craig.
Right. Thank you very much, Britta. Thank you for that. And I love the way that you say you raise a lot of questions, which is absolutely key. We do have a lot of questions that we need to try and answer as we're moving into this new blended, hybrid, and all these other words that now I try and describe it. There are a couple of questions we've got in our Q&A, and maybe I think they're actually similar. I'll just read them out and maybe you can see how you address it. In addition to being outdated in terms of contemporary, local, and international educational practice in real terms, the 2014 Distant Education Policy has a bias that addresses blended learning or e-learning in vague and dismissive terms. The recently proposed blended learning funding framework continues this trend by creating a barrier to innovation and quality ambitions within this space, which obviously is more of a comment. But I think the second one is maybe linked to that. Thank you for the interesting talk. You referred to UKZN as a hybrid university. Is this how traditional universities are now going to be classified? So what is it going forward? What are traditional universities? Are we in a hybrid? And what does this mean? Maybe something on that, please.
Let me just talk to the first one. I know there wasn't actually a question, but there is currently a HEQ task team that's working on how there seems to be a bit of a lag. There is an HEQC task team that is currently working on all these definitions, but then also together with the department looking at how this will impact on funding. So that whole idea of the funding being affected by how we do the online blended and so on. Then so the funding framework will look at that. Yes, the 2014 distance education policy is sort of outdated, so the department will start looking at that. Obviously, you know, during the pandemic, they really had to focus on just keeping things moving, making sure that all the students, both in higher education and in the TVET colleges, actually were able to continue their studies. But there is work being done on that. UKZN as a hybrid university is not my term. I was given that title. And no, it's not necessarily that from the department or the Council on Higher Education side that we are going to classify universities in these kind of terms. There is obviously this overlap now with the institutional types policy document which is out there. No, you will decide as UKZN where you are on those continua, where you are as an institution, where you are in a program or in modules. It won't be from the department or from the council for us to decide. There's a question in the chat I see. Can the hidden curriculum address the challenges of quality assurance in online learning? I actually think the hidden curriculum may be a quality assurance challenge. Reina, I'm not sure how you think it can actually address the challenge. I think often it is the challenge. It is the problem in the sense that the hidden curriculum is what you did not intend, what you are conveying without realizing that you are conveying, the kind of unintended consequences of some of your choices, your curriculum choices, your pedagogical choices, and so on. So I would say the hidden curriculum sometimes is in fact the quality assurance problem. I would not understand why you would want to hide from students what you are trying to achieve. The whole purpose is that students know upfront what you are trying to achieve. And that's part of the design elements, that you design upfront what you want to achieve, how you want to achieve it, and even how you are going to assess whether you've achieved it. And that is shared with the students right at the beginning. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, or maybe I misunderstood your question. Let me just see if there are other questions. Yeah. I don't see any other questions,
Right,
Craig. I don't know if
I think you've answered them all.
any.
Yeah, you've got them all. Thanks, Britta. Thank you very much again from us and from everyone. I think you've left us at an interesting point. We are, as universities, we've got new challenges, and we've got to decide, how is this hybrid model going to work for us? And I think, one of the key things you kept alluding to is choices. There are lots of choices that have to be made, and I take that away. And as universities, as lecturers, as modules, we need to now make decisions. The old days it was all very clear. It was one way, it was all done in one way, and now we've got all these choices, and sometimes that's a little bit disconcerting. But the other point I also take away is design needs to be in place to make things work. And it's quite ironic, I thought, I hadn't actually thought about it like that. We're in this new hybrid e-learning type era where you think you're very flexible, but actually in some ways, as you said, in the old days, when you'd walk into the lecture room, you could almost change what you were going to do on a whim. Now you really have to have pre-planned these things and got it right. And obviously there's flexibility, but it's based on a good design. So very interesting. So thank you, Britta, for that. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for your time.